Okay, so the title of my presentation, Social Science Contributions to Interdisciplinary Research and Extension Collaborations, Benefits and Challenges. So just a little roadmap of where I'll go today. Talk a little bit, I'll do a little bit of definition of terms. I think it's a good idea to define terms, particularly these big terms like interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need to do that kind of research, and especially and most importantly, where does social science fit in? I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of my interdisciplinary research experience, then outline the benefits, what I believe are the major benefits of social science in integrated projects, some of the challenges, of course, because it's not all smooth sailing, and then talk a little bit about some of the strategies that I think are important to promote social and natural science interdisciplinary collaboration. Okay, so interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary science. So it's what we call an emergent but integrative approach to addressing complex problems. Interdisciplinary research, the most important thing about it is that it integrates knowledge across disciplinary boundaries. So if you see this figure on the left-hand side, you can see the 3 bars up and down. That's just disciplinary science, 3 bars separate. You look at the one below that, that's multidisciplinary, so 3 bars, 3 different disciplines there focused on one particular issue, but not necessarily crossing those boundaries. The next one down is interdisciplinary science, where you're actually doing research that integrates knowledge from different disciplines working together to generate, kind of co-generate knowledge. And then the last one is transdisciplinary. And really the only difference between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary science is that transdisciplinary science brings along stakeholders, so works very, non-academic stakeholders, so works along with non-academic stakeholders, NGOs, agencies, and so forth to co-produce research and knowledge and then get it out into the public realm. And so, of course, the goal is to bring diverse scientific perspectives together to better understand and address complex problems. Okay, so why interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, or what we're increasingly calling team science in agriculture? Well, we've heard a lot about it today. Our most pressing problems are also the most complex, usually, and so of course then scientists need to transcend those disciplinary boundaries to work on those complex social ecological problems. As in terms of transdisciplinary research, the scientific community increasingly needs to engage with non-academic stakeholders in order to make our research count, to get our research into the hands of the people that are making policies, that are doing the work on the ground. And then, of course, funding agencies, the people who fund our research, are increasingly turning to these very large grants that require interdisciplinary integrated approaches. NSF and NIFA are actually, putting together things like Robin mentioned, the Infuse from NSF, and then the coordinated agricultural projects really require interdisciplinary approaches and generally ask for a social science component. So what can social science bring to these interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research and extension projects? Well, I think what it can do primarily is help address the human dimension knowledge gaps in our understanding of social ecological systems. These 2 images here are of basically conceptual frameworks that examine complex social ecological systems, and invariably all of these frameworks have kind of the human dimensions part and then the natural science part, so the social and natural sciences, and they come together at various points in the conceptual frameworks, various points across the social ecological spheres. And it's at that nexus of the social and natural where I think, where the opportunities for social scientists and natural scientists to come together and answer some of these very difficult problems lies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my bona fides. I've been working on large-scale interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects for a pretty long time. Today I'm going to talk about 3 of them, 3 of the larger ones. One is I led the social science component of a $20 million project funded by USDA NIFA. It was a coordinated agricultural project called the Corn and Cropping Systems Coordinated Agricultural Project from 2011 to 2016. Some of you in this room were involved in that project. A lot of the research was done here at OSU. And also, since 2008, I've been one of the social science leads on a project called the STRIPS Project at Iowa State University, an interdisciplinary multi-million-dollar project integrating prairie strips into row crop landscapes. I'll say a little bit more about that. And then I direct the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll, which is an annual survey of Iowa farmers. And I'll give a couple more details on that. But first, the STRIPS project. It's kind of a mouthful. It's the science-based trials of row crops integrated with prairie strips. I can never remember that. We just call it the STRIPS project. But basically, it's a very simple concept. It's integrating prairie strips into row crop landscapes in order to reduce nutrient loss, reduce sediment loss, and to increase habitat diversity in Iowa. They're basically contour buffer strips in row crop fields, and a group of us has been doing research on it and then trying to kind of get landowners and farmers across the landscape to adopt them. It's a very complex implementation process because, of course, there's a lot of actors and interests across the social, ecological, agroecosystems in Iowa, and the interests of farmers don't always coincide with the concept of prairie strips. So it's really been requiring diverse disciplines. We've got agronomists, we've got ag and biosystems engineers, entomologists, plant pathologists, landscape ecologists, et cetera on that. A lot of stakeholder partners. We've been working very closely with NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service of the USDA, with the Farm Service Agency, with the number of different groups, and then a lot of different funders, so USDA, NIFA, SARE, et cetera. So very complex interdisciplinary program. Then the Corn-Based Cropping Systems Coordinated Agricultural Project. It was $20 million over 6 years. Involved a 140-person team of scientists, graduate students, and extension specialists, about 20 disciplines represented in that group. It was quite complex, 10 land-grant universities plus ARS. It was an amazing project to be part of, to learn how to kind of bring all those disciplines together, focused on several really important sub-problems involved with climate change and corn-based cropping systems funded by USDA and NIFA. And then last project I'm going to talk about is the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll. It's an annual survey of farmers in Iowa. It's been going on since 1982. What we do primarily with this survey is work with stakeholders, whether they're stakeholders on campus, faculty from departments all over campus, from agronomy to ag and biosystems engineering to economics, wildlife biology, and also external stakeholders, whether it's the Department of Agriculture, the State Department of Agriculture, the Federal Natural Resource Conservation Service, a number of stakeholders who work with farmers and need to know or want to know what farmers think about whatever issues that they're working on so they can meet farmers where they are. And so I develop questions every year working with stakeholders for this survey. So that's a little bit of a background, and now to talk about the top 4 or 5 different reasons or different benefits that social science can bring to interdisciplinary projects. So number 1 is understand your population of interest. So how many here do research or extension on systems and practices that you think that farmers should adopt eventually or may possibly adopt? I see a lot of hands go up. Excellent. So when we're working with publics, with audiences, first thing we have to do, at least for me, my perspective, is first thing we have to do is understand that audience's capacities, needs, perspectives, and limitations. Audiences, oftentimes we have this, what we call the kind of the deficit model of outreach, which kind of conceives of audiences as empty vessels. If we pour knowledge into them, they will be full, and then they will change their behavior, they'll change their ways. Audiences are not empty vessels. They are full of biases and filters, and we all, share this. Biases and filters and concepts that shape the way that we process information that is given to us. So we have to understand those biases, filters, and social pressures and so forth in order to meet our audiences where they are. Because if we have assumptions about where they are, They may be very wrong. We may miss the mark. So social science research methods are ideal for understanding where audiences are. So we have quantitative research, which are primarily sample surveys, also qualitative research, which consists of in-depth interviews, focus groups, and different other research approaches to understand what our target audiences think about whatever issue that we're focused on. So I'm going to give an example from the Corn Cap project, and one of our major objectives of the project was to engage farmers on climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. So cover crops, extended rotations, drainage water management, practices that the project was doing research on and were ostensibly needed to be moved out toward into the farmer population and get some adoption. So our main question, which had never really been asked, was what do farmers think about climate change, right? Because if you're going to talk to farmers about climate change, you might want to know what they think about it. Or if you're going to use climate change as part of your kind of rationale for why they should adopt cover crops, for example, we should know what they think about that. And so we did a survey of farmers across the Corn Belt, about 5,000 farmers across 11 Corn Belt states. And what we found was, answer number one is most farmers don't believe in human drivers of climate change. A lot of them believed in climate change, but not anthropogenic climate change. Number two, through our in-depth interviews, we realized that farmers are much more comfortable talking about weather extremes. So basically our recommendations from that research was, you know, if you're on the front lines, you're an extension person doing work, doing field days and so forth, workshops, winter meetings, and you want to talk about adaptation to climate change, don't talk about climate change, because you could alienate 2/3 of your audience right off the bat. So instead, talk about weather extremes, talk about adapting to weather extremes. I mean, it's very strange, but farmers will definitely say, yes, there's more weather extremes these days, but I'm not sure it's due to climate change. But anyway, so focus on weather extremes and soil health instead. So that's an example of how some of our social science research really was able to inform both the extension side of things and some of the research questions that were being asked. Second example is the farm poll. I've been working with my colleagues over in entomology and weed science for a number of years on herbicide resistance management and pesticide resistance management. So we've put some survey questions in the Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll to try to get a handle on what farmers think. I mean, their objective is to promote resistance management BMPs and community-based resistance management strategies. So we've put these research survey questions in the Iowa Farm Poll about, you know, are farmers concerned? Are they using best management practices? And what we found was that yes, most farmers are concerned about herbicide-resistant weeds and, you know, BT-resistant corn rootworm, but they're not generally using the BMPs. Much to the chagrin of my really outstanding colleagues in weed science, extension weed science, Bob Hartzler and Mike Owen. They've been talking themselves blue about Palmer amaranth for the last 5 or 7 years. 50%, more than 50% of Iowa farmers are not familiar with Palmer amaranth still. So they're like, really? We've been talking. So maybe they're not as doing, you know, maybe their extension strategies are not as effective as they'd hope. Most farmers did say that they supported a broad-based collaborative approach to resistance management, which was great because the Iowa Pest Resistance Management Plan, which was based partly on some of the research we did in the farm poll, is proposing exactly that. So to bring all the stakeholders to the table, the public agencies, the ag retailers, the farmers, and extension together to work on collaborative approaches. And so social science was able to inform that, that plan. Number two is understanding stakeholder partners. And so there was a lot of talk earlier on that set me up very nicely, the importance of stakeholders in the research process. Margaret, I think, talked about how the stakeholder panels, better understanding how stakeholders think, what stakeholders think about our research, our models, and so forth, our extension, is really important, right? So how many here work with stakeholders to help get, you know, shape their research or get their research out across the land? A lot. So it's really important to understand what stakeholders think about our research, about our practices and programs, because they're the ones, they're our natural partners. They're the ones that are helping us to move our research out into the world. And so it's super important to understand what they think about that. And so, you know, it's one thing to kind of talk to them informally and at meetings and kind of get their feedback, but it's another thing to do it in a systematic fashion. And so social science research can actually systematically learn from stakeholders what they think about projects and programs. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about a STRIPS program project example. We have, since the beginning of the project, really involved stakeholders in all of the project activities, but we've also done in-depth interviews, focus groups, and facilitated discussions with staff from NRCS, Department of Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources, NGO groups, to really understand what they think of STRIPS and their ideas for doing a better job of promoting STRIPS across Iowa, and actually other states, so these prairie strips. And so they've given us these great ideas about, well, you've got to get more demonstration sites, and you have to do them here. And you know, you have to give training for our natural resource professionals, because our natural resource professionals are out there talking to farmers. If you would do trainings and let them, you know, get them more familiar with the prairie strips, then they can be your promoters. And the great thing about that is that we learn from them what we need to do, but number two, we were able to take that research-based information and put it into grant proposals to the McKnight Foundation, to the Forest Service, to the Walton Family Foundation, and get funding for those outreach programs that had been suggested by stakeholders. And because we had done it in a systematic fashion, it was really helpful for generating more funds. So, of course, understanding stakeholder partners is important. Another great one, which was mentioned by I've forgotten our last speaker, last lightning talk's name, was it Greg? Greg. Evaluation of projects and programs. And so he talked about how he had done some evaluation of his programs to see how well they're doing. Social science methods are basically what is used in evaluation to answer the question, are projects and programs having expected impacts? Super important. This is just an example again from the STRIPS project. We've got a number of early adopters who have put prairie strips on their landscape, on their farms, on the land that they own. From our perspective, they need to succeed, and we need to understand, if we're going to promote this across the landscape, we need to understand what their successes are and what their challenges are, what their failures are, because if we don't understand the challenges and failures and help them to address them, we're going nowhere. And so this has been the research that we've done, annual surveys, and then also kind of in-depth interviews and focus group conversations with the people who are early adopters of these prairie strips, helps us to understand how we can do a better job of working with them and then adopters in the future. So really, you know, the evaluation can't be overemphasized. Understanding what's working and what's not working is really important. So number 4, I think this is, from my perspective, perhaps the most important aspect of interdisciplinary projects and programs that bring in social and natural sciences together. I think that learning about different disciplines and approaches makes us all better scientists. You know, social scientists working with natural sciences learn how to collect data more effectively. So, you know, we don't necessarily know if we're doing research on, you know, herbicide resistance management or cover crops. You know, we're not born knowing how to, you know, put together a good survey question on cover crops. So working with natural scientists, and natural scientists aren't necessarily good at it either. But if we sit down together and talk about, you know, what it takes. Whoa, sorry about that. Stand back. What it takes to plant cover crops, to terminate them, and all these other kind of intricacies of management. Then we can develop really good questions for our surveys together. And then on the flip side, natural scientists can learn how to situate their research in social context. So, you know, you develop an idea on the research farm, and learning how to think about how farmers and other audiences their perspectives on that particular technology or innovation, whatever, you can situate that in that social context. And so I think that's really important. But, you know, overall, the most important thing is that together we can learn how to ask better research questions and how to do better outreach. So, what are the challenges? Well, there's a number of them, and I'll start with the one that's also the most important benefit, is learning each other's science. It's not necessarily easy. It's actually really hard. I mean, it's hard enough for us to keep track of our own disciplinary science. There's always a lot of stuff happening. There's new articles coming out every day. The thought of learning somebody else's science can be intimidating because, after all, that's what we have disciplines for, right? We specialize and we get to be experts in our disciplines. So learning somebody else's science is hard because there's different terminologies, there's different paradigms, there's different research designs. For example, in social science, we very rarely do experiments. In natural science, experiments is kind of the basis of everything. In social science, we tend to get, at least historically, we tend to get in trouble when we do experiments. So we shy away from that. And it's also very hard because our research subjects are very slippery. It's hard to do experiments with them. But, you know, there's different ideas about what's important in terms of research questions and that sort of thing. And then there's questions primarily from natural scientists about the rigor and soundness of social science research. And it's good. I mean, we don't necessarily understand each other's science. I've been asked many times. I do both quantitative survey research and also qualitative interviews and focus groups, and I've been asked a number of times, what's the difference between journalism and qualitative research, in-depth interviews? And it's a really important question because to the casual observer, maybe it's the same thing. But there are I won't go into it now, but there are some rules and rigor to qualitative research and quantitative research in social science that are really important. But that's part of the communication across disciplines and learning about each other's science. Another complicating factor is that interdisciplinary team building takes time. It's part of the difficulty, but we don't have time generally, and time is a very precious commodity for us, and so taking the time to build those teams is hard. And it's not necessarily obvious how different disciplines best complement each other, particularly when we're talking about social and natural sciences. And so the process can, it can generally start with the grant proposal. In my experience, it's generally started with grant proposals, and then it evolves over time. You can't expect a quick and easy team building. You start with something, but you have to keep on going. Okay, so some strategies to make it happen. It doesn't happen just by itself. You have to be purposive about bringing disciplines together in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. So and I'm going to just give a few examples of the types of efforts to bring the disciplines together that I think have been really effective. Number one has been field days for scientists and stakeholders. Typically we do field days for farmers, right? We invite farmers and other audiences in to look at our science, and we talk about our science communicating to farmers. One of the first things we did, and I don't know if this was unique to our corn cap project, but one of the first things we did in our second annual meeting was when really things were all coming together, which was right here in Worcester. We had a field day for the scientists and stakeholders that were along here. So this is a great picture. Does anybody recognize that guy? He's small. Dr. Warren Dick, who's in the room. There he is, back there. So I'll never forget, this was really an eye-opening experience for me to learn from all the different scientists about what they were doing. This one in particular, so this is August of 2012. It hadn't rained for a long time, and this is the long-term no-till trials, 30-some years in no-till. And behind it, you can see some of the tilled ground. We were all marveling because we had just come from different places across the landscape. We'd driven and flown to get to Worcester, and we'd seen a lot of corn that, wasn't very high and it was looking yellow. And then Dick's corn here was, 10 foot tall and very green. But anyway, long story short, we had all these stations set up where everybody, all the different scientists from all the different disciplines can go around and learn from the disciplinary scientists what they were doing. So the agronomists learned from those who were measuring greenhouse gases. And then we've had social science setups where people come in, and it's not, you don't pick and choose. Everybody has to go to every station and to learn what they're doing. With the STRIPS project down in the lower right there, we've got a number of demonstration projects across Iowa, and we regularly bring stakeholders, whether they're from Iowa and agencies and NGOs. This is a group of lower right hand. This is a group of Iowa State economists that we wanted to bring down there so they could understand, think about the economics of prairie strips. And so this was just a super effective way of helping each other understand how we do science, the kinds of questions that we ask, and the kind of results that we're looking at. Another way to do it, and was really probably the most difficult part of the Corn Cap project and other projects that I've been involved in, is interdisciplinary group work. So when you think about synthesizing and integrating the results of your research, it's not always obvious. And so these are kind of tables where we were, set up in interdisciplinary groups. You can see there's one table there, Ratan Lal there in the foreground. There's a bunch of Ohio State folks there. Christy Leakey's is in one of these. But these are all like activities to help us understand each other's science and how each other's science might fit together and how our research and our results can fit together. And the thing that we found, and thanks to Lois Wright Morton, who's up in the upper left there, she's very a willful person. She basically made it clear to us that she wasn't going to quit until we got it, was to just keep on doing it over and over and then repeat, because it takes us a really long time to learn how to work together sometimes. So other strategies to foster interdisciplinary work. So in ongoing projects, I think this is a great example of what we're doing here today. So lightning talks, poster sessions, webinars, just the constant sharing of research and the willingness of all of us in different disciplines to take the time to read each other's stuff, to talk to each other about what we're doing and why, and what's the importance of our results. Developing interdisciplinary teams and working groups organized around project objectives. When you have these large-scale grants, there's project objectives. Get interdisciplinary teams, as you're planning the project, plan it with interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary teams in mind. Cross working groups, sharing activities. So even though you have these different working groups, you've got to bring them together to share what they're doing. And then regular full team meetings, and then synthesis reports and manuscripts. I mean, this is probably the hardest part, but trying to figure out ways that you can publish articles with multiple sciences coming together, focused on singular research questions. Now, if you're starting from scratch, I know this is kind of a hard thing, but I think it's something that needs to be talked about a little bit. I think developing interdisciplinary research groups around shared interests like water quality and soil health, and getting them together and seeing how they can develop these long-term working teams. And starting, I think from my perspective, starting with the funding opportunity is best, like before the RFP comes out or right when the RFP comes out. Get your social scientists and your natural scientists together. Please don't call the social scientist at the end of the proposal writing process. That's happened to me a number of times. I'm sure some other social scientists in the room have experienced the natural science team calling up and saying, hey, we just realized we need a social scientist. Can you join us? And I have said yes, because I'm extension. I generally say yes to everything. But it's much better when you start at the beginning and you can really work together. Meeting regularly to figure out how all the pieces fit together. One of the really important tools that I've found in these groups is to develop like conceptual frameworks that diagram the different disciplinary contributions to the research problem, so we can kind of all see, here's the research problem, here are the disciplines, here's what we do, how does it all fit together in kind of a flow chart. That's been super helpful, and then you can put it into the grant proposal, and it helps the proposal reviewers to figure it out too. And if the grant isn't awarded, keep at it, because cohesiveness builds over time. And also when you get the and when you get the grants, you're working on the grants, be open to like spin-off opportunities. A lot of the proposals I've been working on recently have been, subgroups from the Corn Cap or from the STRIPS project. A couple of ag and biosystems engineers and I, who've been working on the STRIPS project, are now submitted an NSF proposal to look at antimicrobial resistant bacteria and how they move through water systems, through the landscape. And so just be open to kind of spin-offs and creative ways of putting different folks together. So just a few closing thoughts. I was telling Jeff earlier on today that you guys have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to natural resource related social science folks. I mean, you have, I think I counted, I know a number of them personally, but I looked on the website, you've got 7 or 8 sociologists and social psychologists, and then ag and natural resource-based economists, like a dozen social scientists that work on natural resource issues. I don't think that there's a land grant university in the country that has what you guys have here. So it's pretty amazing. And then you also have natural scientists who really appreciate the value of social science research. I mean, Margaret, I think she's an honorary social scientist because she's actually gone out and done in-depth interviews for some stuff and worked with social scientists at Purdue. But I know a number of natural scientists here really appreciate the value of social science research and what it can do for the group. But you know, big picture, these difficult problems that we face really demand interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches, working together with stakeholders. Stakeholders have a lot to bring to the table. Listening to them in both formal and informal ways. And I think, you know, together we learn to do better research and engagement, better research and extension. And last but not least, I'll say that for me personally, the interdisciplinary research projects that I've been on have been the most fun and rewarding projects that I've worked on in my career. And pretty much now I just don't really like to do disciplinary research. I like to go out and work with people from other fields so I can learn from them and hopefully them learn from me. With that, I'll end, and I think we've got time for questions. A lot of time for questions.